It was a stormy night in Maple Grove, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. I, Zach, had invited my friends Liam and Aria over for a horror movie marathon at my place. Little did we know that we were about to experience one of the scariest true home invasion stories. As we set up the living room for our movie night, a loud thud from the upstairs floor startled us. The noise was like something heavy being thrown against a wall. We exchanged apprehensive glances but decided to check it out. Assuming it was just a fallen object due to the storm, we cautiously climbed the creaking stairs, noting the abnormal silence that hung over the house. I went ahead, my pulse quickening with each step. Upon reaching the upper hallway, I froze. A shadowy figure stood with its back to us, staring out the window of my bedroom. "Hey, who are you? How did you get in?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face hidden behind a disturbing mask. It was a bulky man dressed entirely in black. His silence was oppressive, as he stared at us with cold, calculating eyes. Liam and Aria moved closer to me, their faces pale with fear. "Zach, what's going on?" Aria murmured, her voice trembling. Without warning, the intruder advanced towards us, making us retreat in panic. In that instant, I realized we were living one of the most terrifying home invasion stories. The intruder kept advancing, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. We backed up until our backs touched the cold wall, leaving us cornered. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. This was one of those scary night stories I never imagined living through. "He's got a knife!" Liam shouted, his voice laden with panic. The faint light of the corridor reflected off the sharp blade the intruder held, making my stomach churn. In that moment, I realized we were living through one of the most terrifying real-life home invasions. Aria started screaming for help, her voice blending with the sound of the storm outside. I prayed that a neighbor might hear us, but I knew the chances were slim. The masked man hesitated for a moment, as if assessing his options. Then, in a sudden move, he turned and ran towards the stairs, relieved but still trembling. We cautiously made our way downstairs. Our hearts were still racing, adrenaline coursing through our veins. Upon reaching the kitchen, we saw the intruder with his back to us, rummaging through one of the drawers. The fear returned with full force, turning our brief sense of relief into sheer terror. "This is your last chance to get out before we call the police," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Liam had grabbed a heavy frying pan, brandishing it as a makeshift weapon. The man slowly turned, his cold eyes fixed on us through the eerie mask. With a surprisingly agile move, the intruder hurled an object in our direction. Instinctively, we ducked, and the object, which I recognized as one of my kitchen knives, sank into the wall behind us with a dull thud. My heart raced even faster. If that was even possible, this scary home invasion was becoming increasingly dangerous. Aria, in a burst of courage, grabbed the fire extinguisher hanging on the kitchen wall. With a determined cry, she activated it, spraying a cloud of chemical powder directly into the intruder's face. The man staggered back, coughing and frantically rubbing his eyes. "Now, let's go," I shouted, grabbing Liam and Aria's arms. Taking advantage of the intruder's distraction, we ran towards the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob, but we finally managed to open it and rushed out into the stormy night. The icy rain hit us like needles, but we barely noticed. We ran down the street screaming for help, our voices blending with the thunder. The lights in the neighboring houses started to turn on, and curious, concerned faces appeared in the windows. We were living a true horror story, one of those real-life scary stories you never imagine happening to you. Out of breath and drenched, we stopped at Mr. Thompson's house. 2 houses down the street, he opened the door, his eyes wide with concern. "Goodness, what happened to you?" he asked, pulling us inside. Shivering with cold and fear, we quickly recounted our terrifying experience to Mr. Thompson. His eyes widened even further as we shared the events of the night. One of the most bone-chilling home invasions Maple Grove had ever seen. "I've already called the police," Mr. Thompson said, handing us dry towels. "They should be here any moment." As if on cue, we heard the sirens approaching. Minutes later, several police cars pulled up in front of my house. their lights flashing in the rainy night. The officers questioned us, taking down every detail of our horrifying true story. "You guys did well," Officer Reed said. "Many don't survive such violent home invasions." As the police searched my house and the neighborhood, we learned that the intruder had fled into the woods at the back of the property. The disturbing mask had been found discarded in the backyard, but there were no other traces of him. In the days that followed, our story spread quickly. Reporters showed up, wanting to hear our account for documentaries about home invasions. Quiet Maple Grove was shaken, and residents started installing security systems. For us three, the emotional scars ran deep. Nightmares and anxiety became constant companions. We attended group therapy for home invasion survivors, struggling to cope with the trauma. Months later, sitting on the porch of my newly renovated and now fortified home, we reflected on that terrifying night. "You know," Liam said, "I don't think I'll ever be able to watch a horror movie again." Ari and I silently agreed. After all, we had lived through our own real-life horror story, an experience that changed us forever. The nightmare on Maple Grove Street became a somber reminder that danger can be closer than we think. Even in the quietest neighborhoods, our story serves as a warning. Sometimes, the line between the fictional thrill of horror movies and the real-life horror can be dangerously thin. That afternoon remains etched in my memory like an indelible scar. I, Ezra, only 10 years old, and my brother Thorn, 8, were on our way back from school with our mother Gail. Our substitute teacher, Ms. Wren, kindly gave us a ride in her worn-out car. The setting sun painted the sky with an unsettling red as we drove down the winding road that snaked its way to our isolated home. We lived in a remote area where the idea of crime seemed as distant as the stars. Our father, Flint, spent the week working away, staying at our grandfather's place, and only returning on weekends. This routine enveloped us in a false sense of security that would soon be shattered. We arrived home around 4 p.m., and immediately something felt wrong. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the chilly autumn breeze. My mother furrowed her brow, her expression transforming from confusion to alarm in mere seconds. "Stay in the car," she ordered, her usually firm voice now trembling like leaves in the wind. I watched through the foggy car window as she cautiously approached the entrance. Her tense body reflected the fear that was starting to spread in my chest like ice. Ms. Wren, immobile behind the wheel, gripped it so tightly her fingers seemed poised to leave permanent marks. The silence that followed as my mother entered the house seemed eternal. Then, we heard a muffled scream that cut through the air like a sharp blade. That sound marked the beginning of one of the most terrifying nights of my life. A home invasion experience that would become a real-life nightmare, forever altering our perception of safety and trust in the world we thought we knew. My mother's scream echoed in my ears, triggering a wave of panic that enveloped me completely. Without thinking twice, I jumped out of the car and ran towards the house, ignoring Ms. Wren's desperate protests. Thorn, my younger brother, followed close behind, his steps echoing mine in a symphony of fear. As I crossed the threshold, I was greeted by a scene of chaos that I will never forget. Our living room, once a haven of comfort and security, now resembled a horror movie set. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out of their places, and our belongings scattered across the floor like confetti from a macabre party. "Mom!" I shouted, my voice trembling. I found her on her knees in the kitchen, her trembling hands trying to gather the shards of glass from a broken picture frame or last family photo. Her eyes, when they turned to me, were wide with terror and disbelief. "Ezra, Thorn, stay close to me," she whispered, pulling us near. It was then that I noticed the glaring absences. Our television, the VCR, even the old metal box where my mother kept her couponcil were gone. The intruder, or intruders, had taken not only our possessions but also our sense of safety. Miss Wren entered right behind us, breathless and pale. "I've already called the police," she announced, her voice slightly shaking. "They're on their way." Those words should have brought comfort, but they only solidified the reality of our situation. We were victims of a home invasion, one of the true scary stories that you hear about but never imagine happening to you. The hours that followed seemed to drag on like an eternity. The police, who should have been our immediate salvation, took an absurdly long time to arrive, about 3 hours. Every passing minute increased our anxiety, fueling the terrors that our imagination conjured. As we waited, my mother tried to maintain calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She kept us close, like a lioness protecting her cubs. Ms. Wren stayed with us, her presence an anchor of normalcy amidst the chaos that had settled in our home. "What if they come back?" Thorne whispered at one point, giving voice to the fear we all shared. My mother hugged him tightly but couldn't find the words to soothe him. The silence that followed was scarier than any response. Finally, we heard the sound of sirens approaching. 2 officers, Officer Hawk and Detective Rook, arrived with serious expressions. As they examined the scene, asking questions only made the situation more real and terrifying. "Do you usually leave your doors unlocked?" Officer Hawk asked, his tone a mix of concern and reproach. My mother nodded, ashamed. "We never thought something like this could happen here," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Rook, with a compassionate yet firm gaze, warned us, "Unfortunately, home invasions like this are not as rare as we think, and there's always the risk that the criminals might come back, especially knowing your house is an easy target." Their words landed on us like a crushing weight. The idea that our home, our sanctuary, could be invaded again was almost unbearable. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, a chapter filled with distrust and constant fear. After the police left, our home was enveloped in an oppressive silence. Ms. Wren, reluctant to leave us alone, offered to stay with us for the night. My mother, grateful, accepted the offer. That night, I slept in my mother's bed, with Thorne on the other side. The room that was once a refuge now felt like a fragile fortress against the horrors of the outside world. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the moonlight, transformed into a potential intruder in my hyper-vigilant mind. The days that followed were an exercise in paranoia and adaptation. My father, Flint, rushed back, his face a mask of guilt and concern. He installed new locks, alarms, and security lights, transforming our once welcoming home into a fortress. But the real changes occurred within us. My mother, once so confident and carefree, now obsessively checked the locks. Thorne developed a fear of the dark that persists to this day. And me? Well, I lost something I didn't even know I had: the unconditional sense of safety in my own home. The scary and true home invasion stories are not just tales to scare children. They are brutal realities that leave invisible scars, forever altering the way we view the world. Even years later, I still catch myself checking the locks repeatedly, ever vigilant for the slightest unusual sound. That night taught me a painful lesson about the fragility of safety. The scary home invasions are not just isolated events, but traumas that echo through time, shaping our actions and thoughts in ways we never imagined. Today, as an adult, I understand that the true horror is not in the stolen objects or the mess left behind. It's in the violation of our most intimate space, in the loss of innocence and trust. The true horror stories don't end when the immediate danger passes. They continue living within us, constantly reminding us of our vulnerability. In the end, we survived that terrible night, but a part of us was left behind, lost in the darkness of that invaded home. And although we move forward, the memories of that terrifying home invasion remain as a constant reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not supernatural, they are terrifyingly, painfully human. The salty sea breeze blew in through my slightly open window, carrying with it the comforting sound of waves crashing on the beach. It was a night like any other in Seaside, Oregon, or so I thought. My name is Collins, and this is my true story of a home invasion that changed my life forever. It was 3:30 a.m. when I got home from my shift at the local bar. I was exhausted but pleased with the generous tips from the night. I lived in a beach house with 3 other college roommates, but my room was the only one on the ground floor. Usually this didn't bother me, but on that night, this fact would prove crucial. I quickly changed out of my work clothes, eager to crawl into bed and let the sound of the ocean lull me to sleep. Little did I know that the next few minutes would turn into a real-life nightmare. One of those scary and true home invasion stories that you hear about, but never imagine will happen to you. I was almost asleep when a subtle noise woke me up. At first I thought it was just the wind, but soon I realized the sound was coming from my window. Someone was messing with the screen. My heart raced. It must be one of my roommates, I thought, trying to calm myself. But why wouldn't they have called me first? With my body tense and adrenaline coursing through my veins, I quietly pressed myself against the wall next to my bed. That's when I saw him, a man in a black hoodie, crouched outside my window, methodically cutting the screen with a utility knife. In that moment, I realized I was about to become a statistic. Another case in the true scary home invasion stories that fill newspaper headlines. Time seemed to freeze as I watched, paralyzed, the intruder cutting through my window screen. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't a horror story I was watching on TV. It was real, it was happening to me, and I needed to act fast. When the man started to stand up to climb in, my survival instinct took over. In a quick and desperate move, I jumped on my bed and, using all the force I could muster, kicked the intruder's chest with both feet. The impact was surprisingly strong, knocking him backwards. The sound of the intruder's body colliding with the bike rack in the parking lot echoed in the silent night. He fell motionless, seemingly unconscious. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I quickly shut and locked the window, my hands shaking uncontrollably. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. "Emergency. What's your situation?" The calm voice of the dispatcher brought me back to reality. "There's been a home invasion attempt at my house," I managed to say between ragged breaths. He tried to come through my window. I kicked him, and he fell. I think he's unconscious out there." As I waited for the police to arrive, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. What if he woke up? What if he had an accomplice? This was one of those scary home invasions you hear about, but never expect to experience yourself. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. I realized how fragile our sense of security is, how we can become victims in our own homes. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, I heard the sirens approaching, bringing momentary relief. When the officers arrived, the intruder had already disappeared, leaving behind only the cut screen as a silent testament to the nightmare I had just lived through. "Mr. Collins," said Officer Brody, a robust man with tired eyes, "can you tell us exactly what happened?" I repeated my story, my voice still shaking. As I spoke, I noticed a look of concern pass between the officers. "You said your windows were open?" Officer Parker asked, her voice a mix of concern and a hint of reproach. I felt a twinge of guilt and frustration. "Yes, I like to listen to the ocean," I replied defensively. "I didn't think." My voice trailed off. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. This wasn't just one of the many true horror stories we hear about. It was my story, my own nightmarish experience. As the police searched the area, I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, trying to process what had happened. It was then that Officer Brody's radio crackled to life. "Suspect detained 2 blocks from here," matches the description provided. The relief I felt was momentary. Officer Parker approached with a grave expression. "Mr. Collins, we found the suspect. He had a backpack with concerning items, restraints, duct tape, and he has a history of sexual assault." The words landed on me like stones in my stomach. This wasn't just a scary home invasion. It could have been much worse. The following hours passed in a blur of statements, questions, and paperwork. When the sun finally rose, illuminating the ocean I once loved to hear, I now viewed it through tightly shut windows. I had learned the hard way about the importance of residential security, but also about my own strength. This home invasion experience had shaken my perception of safety to the core. The days that followed were a challenge when it came to sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. My roommates, Axel, Sage, and Phoenix, tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in their eyes too. Our house, once a refuge, now felt like a minefield of potential dangers. We decided to beef up our security. We installed alarms, extra locks, and even cameras. But the real change was within me. This terrifying home invasion had shaken my sense of safety to its core. A week after the incident, I received a call from the prosecution. The intruder, identified as Maddox Reeves, would be tried, and I needed to testify. The idea of reliving that night made me nauseous, but I knew it was necessary. This was my role in the true survival stories, my chance to ensure Maddox couldn't do this to anyone else. In court, I faced Maddox for the first time since that night. His cold eyes met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. As I narrated the events of that night, my voice trembled, but I remained firm. This was my home invasion testimony, my true scary story that could help prevent future crimes. When the verdict was announced guilty on all counts, he felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Maddox would be behind bars, unable to hurt others. Sadness for the realization that there are people full of such evil. I returned home that night with a new perspective. The ocean waves still sang their nocturnal song, but now I listened to them through tightly closed windows. I had learned the hard way about the importance of residential security, but also about my own strength. This experience taught me that true horror stories aren't just the ones we read in books or watch in home invasion documentaries. They can happen to anyone, at any time. But I also learned that we are stronger than we think, capable of facing our worst fears and surviving. Today, as I write this account, I hope my story serves as a warning and a source of strength for others. Sometimes the true monsters aren't supernatural. They are ordinary humans with sinister intentions. Yet, with vigilance, courage, and mutual support, we can overcome even the darkest of nights. My suspenseful home invasion may have ended, but the lesson I learned will stay with me forever. True safety begins with awareness and ends with action. And although we may become victims, we also have the power to become survivors and eventually victors. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.